good afternoon. My name is Richard Harvey. I'm from Spectralink, and this afternoon I'm going to talk about clinical smartphone device criteria. So, first of all, I should probably make clear that there isn't one device which works for every single person in a healthcare enterprise. So I want to focus on who we're talking about. And we're talking about workers who are continuously mobile. They really aren't at a desk to have a desk phone. They typically don't they don't need communication, work communication when they're off-site. So typically a good example would be a nurse. Doctors, they typically will have a cellular telephone which allows them to communicate whilst they're in the building and off-site. Nurses typically work 10, 11, 12-hour shifts, then they leave the building, somebody else takes their device and replaces that nurse. So when I'm talking about for the target users here, we're talking about clinicians like nurses who are working within a building. So from an IT perspective, what we found is you need a device strategy. In the absence of a device, users will create their own strategy to solve their own communication problems. A great example of this is secure text messaging. The hospitals often say that nurses should not use their own consumer phones within their facility. The reality is, the studies have shown that nurses will use their personal smartphones to do texting because the company hasn't provided one. And in many cases, the hospitals actually have policies preventing personal cell phones being used, but yet the nurses will continue to use them, and that presents risks of HIPAA violations when PHI information goes astray. So the key point here is, from an IT or a management perspective, you need to develop a device strategy to ensure you're giving the right tools to your users so that they don't get creative and start creating their own communication policies. So why wouldn't you just allow people to use their own personal smartphones within an enterprise? If people have their own smartphones, then of course you've got the risk that they're spending the day playing Angry Birds or Facebook. You have a considerable security risk where you're putting out unsecured devices. Even if you use an MDM, you have the risk of malware applications getting onto your network. There was a recent example in California where a hospital had ransomware introduced, and they had to pay $17,000 to unlock their encrypted data due to the malware. And lastly, it creates a very complex management problem when you introduce BYOD. When you do an MDM, you're typically using a location-based system, so now inadvertently you're tracking users when they're off-site, most likely. You have the challenge of managing corporate data versus user data. If you decide to get rid of an employee, and this has happened, they do a wipe on the device and they accidentally delete user data, you have a lawsuit on your hands. So from an IT perspective, BYOD creates complications like having to support a variety of different device models. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is have just a single device or a family of devices that you actually manage and control, and it creates a much simpler management problem. So let's say you've said, you know what, you're not going to do personal devices, you're going to provide devices for all your staff. You really have three fundamental choices. You have the traditional in-building wireless telephones, which look like these. These have been around for probably 5 to 10 years, voice over Wi-Fi only, but they're the old school feature telephones. The other option is you can deploy a consumer smartphone in an enterprise, or you can use designed for healthcare smartphones. And these things are designed specifically for in-building use. They have particular benefits over consumer smartphones. But the key driver is, when you're deciding the device, it's not the sexiness of the feature. You need to consider, what kind of applications do my users require? What are the use cases? And I'm going to drill down in that in the next couple of slides. So when you consider deploying a device, what you need to do is think about, what are the kinds of things my user is going to need to do. I've touched on secure text messaging. Obviously you have telephony. But then you start looking at things like location, staff safety, and this varies geographically. Certain countries will have legislation which makes various applications more relevant. So in the US, we've had meaningful use, which has driven EMR adoption. So nurses want EMR applications or need EMR applications on there. I've talked about secure text messaging. In Europe and in Australia, staff safety and RTLS, where you can locate a worker, is very important, and they have legislation to ensure that the hospitals are deploying this. So part of it is understanding who are my users, or who are the users, and what are they trying to do. And in the next couple of slides, I'll drill down into a few. I can't consider all of them in the time I have today, but I can drill down into some applications which are relevant in healthcare in most cases. So I've touched on secure text messaging. It really is highly prevalent, and the key point is these applications allow you to do it in a HIPAA-compliant fashion. They don't secure the actual text on the device, so if the device gets stolen, either the texts are actually encrypted using some kind of secure encryption, or they're stored in the cloud, such that when you do lose your device, or if the device gets stolen, or if somebody grabs the device, that typically these texts which have patient information are in a protected fashion. It solves again the problem of the users getting their own devices. Most of these applications can be deployed on in-building devices, but if physicians want to be able to use it, they can put it on their own personal smartphones too. This is probably the number one ask from an application perspective on smartphone-like devices in North American hospitals today. They are, without doubt, it is the key driver for choosing a device like this, which allows you to do full, QWERTY-type keyboard texting, versus something like this, where you really wouldn't want to spend the time texting. So that's going to be it. Again, going back to your users, what are they trying to do? If they need to do text messaging, you would lean towards a smartphone-type device. And the other data point here is once users get comfortable doing texting, you'll find the number of calls will decline, and texts are things which you don't have to respond to immediately. If you get a phone call, generally you don't know if that's an urgent call or a non-urgent call, unless there's some kind of differentiated ringtone. And what we'll find is that users will actually stop making calls, and there'll be 10 times as many texts to calls. And that helps your users be a little more productive because they're not getting interrupted quite so often. Nurse cointegration. And this is probably the number two ask, or the number two deployment of an application with a mobile device. The real problem, of course, is hospitals get graded using their HCAHPS scores, and one of the things is, are the nurses responsive to the patient's needs? By having some kind of mobile device, which allows the nurse to be able to respond in a timely way when the patient pushes the nurse call button in the room. Without a smartphone device or any kind of mobile device, of course, if they're working on a patient, they're unaware that there's a nurse call event unless they go into the corridor and see the light. By having clinical mobile devices, and depending on how much information gets presented to the phone. So what can happen is you get a nurse call notification. The nurse can acknowledge it, but then she can start drilling down, and with a big color screen, it allows a lot of these nurse call solutions actually tie into RTLS to know where the nurse is. They tie into the patient record so that they can drill down and present more information to the nurse so that she can make a more accurate assessment of the situation and can decide whether she needs to go immediately respond or if the situation can wait. So again, part of it is, what kind of information do you want to present to the nurse to be able to help her make a better assessment of the kind of response she needs to apply. And again, the key driver is here. Why would hospitals implement this? Is because they're getting graded on the response to the patient, and ultimately that improves the nurse's performance and productivity. And again, RTLS, such as using Error Scout, allows you to only send the alerts to the nurses who are closest, or depending on the algorithm, it's another data point of helping you notify the right nurses at the right time. And lastly, again, I'm not going to drill down into all the applications, but telephony, it's been around for over 100 years, and I think it gets, even though I've said that there are a lot more texts to calls, once people get accustomed, the reality is if you're having or you need a long conversation with somebody, sending a text is pretty frustrating. What you'll do is you'll pick up the phone and you'll make a call. Now, when people When people apply consumer smartphones in hospitals, they typically run them as a voice over Wi-Fi device, so there is no cellular capability per se, because they don't want to pay the monthly tariffs. But the consumer smartphones aren't optimized for voice over Wi-Fi. So going back to the decision criteria, a lot of these in-building devices have a heavily optimized Wi-Fi stack, so that when you move across the facility, so when the nurse is moving to a patient room, what you don't want is choppy audio where she's trying to explain to a physician something's happening and the physician can't hear, or vice versa. So that even though telephony is no longer sexy and it's often considered, just like it just should work, the reality is it doesn't just work. And it's actually one of the more technically complex problems to solve with these devices. So a lot of the in-building devices have a very optimized stack to enable that high quality voice in all situations. And again, I go back to the telephony piece on its own is interesting, but when you tie it into nurse call, when the nurse gets the notification, she can make a phone call immediately to that nurse. I think the key point I want to take away, this is my last slide, which is you really need a solution mindset. Again, you don't just go in and pick the device because it's the sexiest, newest consumer device on the world. You need to start thinking about, what are my users, what are they trying to do, what kind of applications am I using? And it may involve multiple vendors to solve your solution. You may use a vendor for RTLS, you may use another vendor for the middleware, you may use another vendor for secure text messaging, you may find one. It really is, you need to understand what are the use cases you're trying to solve, who are the users, do they have different set of use cases, and come up with a solution based on those criteria. And in the absence of a device strategy, users will create their own, and that presents risks from a PHI violation perspective. So, any questions? Thank you very much.